Good evening, everyone. Come on in the room. Come on in the room. It's your girl, Marcy Thomas, and I'm super excited to be here with you for another episode of the BGC Book Club. So, as you're joining us, please feel free to share where you're joining us from. I'm coming to you from the outskirts of ATL, and I'm just super excited to be here. Even though I'm dressed like it's winter, it's actually pretty warm here today. So it's pretty exciting to have warm weather in the middle of the winter time. So just to let you know a little bit about BGC Book Club, it's been around since actually April of 2020 during the pandemic. You know, if you can look behind me, you see I have tons and tons of books. And I love to read. And I just really wanted to have a space where I could come on and be able to share my love of reading with others and then also be able to talk to fabulous Black women writers. So that's what this is all about. And if it's your first time, welcome. And I hope that it won't be the last. So tonight, I'm super excited to have someone that I've actually had a chance to meet in person back in October at the Well-Read Black Girl Festival. And that is Mecca Jamilah Sullivan, PhD, who is the author of the novel Big Girl, which is a New York Times Editor's Choice selection and a Best Book pick from Time, Essence, Vulture, Ms., Goodreads, and more. She's also the author of The Poetics of Difference, which is the winner of the 2023 Modern Language Association William Sanders Scarborough Prize, and the short story collection Blue Talk and Love from 2015, which is the winner of the Judith Markowitz Award for Fiction from Lambda Literary. Mecca is an associate professor of English at Georgetown University, and born and raised in Harlem. She currently lives in Washington, D.C. So without any further delay, welcome, Mecca.
Hello, thank you so much, Marcy. This is great. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. As I mentioned, I had a chance to meet you back in the fall and it was great. And I said, I'm going to get you on here. So
and we made it happen.
Make it happen. Make it happen. So, well, of course, you've done a lot of writing and you're an award-winning writer. So congrats on all of your success as far as that's concerned.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, but Big Girl is actually your first novel, though.
Yes.
All right. So what was it that inspired you to write a novel, even though you've done a lot of other things or worked in a lot of other genres?
Yeah, it's so funny. Big Girl, so it's interesting. Big Girl is my third book, my first novel, but it's also the first book I ever really thought about writing. It's the book that made me want to be a writer. Even before I started writing short stories, before I started, writing literary theory, this novel has been with me ever since I really was the age of the protagonist, Malaya, ever since I was a big Black girl growing up in Harlem, really learning about how my body was understood by other people, all of the things it meant to other people, and seeing a space in our literature for that story to be told. This is what made me want to be a writer in the first place. So in some ways, this novel has been with me, as long as I've been here, to be honest. And it definitely has motivated me to kind of like pursue my craft, really develop as a writer. And I've just kind of stuck to it, through decades and through, all these other writing projects. This book has never really left my mind or my heart.
Well, that's good to know. And as we get into it, we can talk about the ways in which her life may parallel yours in some ways, because the book takes place in Harlem. You are from Harlem. And as I was saying before we came in, you and I are both really tall girls. So, there are things that we experience as being quote unquote big in society. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. So for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, just give us a little idea of what the story is actually about.
Sure. I think of Big Girl as a story about Black women, about women in general, Black LGBTQ people, people of color more broadly, and the paths we take often across generations to make space for ourselves in the world. So it follows Malaya Clondon from the time she's an 8-year-old, kind of big Black 8-year-old girl, to the time she's a very big Black queer teenager. And she's kind of coming to understand her body, all of the meanings of her body, and ultimately making decisions about who she wants to be, how she wants to make room for herself in the world, what kind of lessons learned from her family she wants to keep with her, and which she needs to let go of in order to be her full self.
Yes, that's definitely. I just enjoyed reading the story for so many different reasons, just knowing that and seeing her, how she moved through life and how the things that she's taught and the way she's being raised. All of those things play a factor, and just dealing with other people's issues. I mean, just so much. So much in the story.
That's right.
So please, if you don't mind, just share a little bit of the story so everybody can get a feel for how you write or how the story reads.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of the second section. So all you need to know here is it's 1996. Hip hop is sort of commercial hip hop, right? It's kind of on the rise, on the come up. This is set in Harlem. It's kind of in its early phases of gentrification. And Malaya is 15 years old. She's been attending school on the Upper East Side, but suddenly a whole influx of people of color, students of color, have come into this school. And so she's having this kind of awakening, and she's on 125th Street getting ready to shop for jeans. The scents of black coconut and African pear oils wafted toward Malaya from the tables that lined the street. As she walked, the smells of fried and jerk chicken, roti and rice pudding, platanos and candy yams seeped from the storefront restaurants, mixing together like the ingredients of a gumbo. They spilled over Malaya as she walked down block after endless block, veering inward toward the stores to make room for a hurried dreadlock man in a hoodie, then outward to avoid colliding with a cluster of children giggling in bubble jackets and scarves. She fingered the 3 purple braids that hung from her left temple and made games for herself as she walked, trying not to imagine what 125th Street thought of her, this double-wide block of black girls streaked with color, bounding toward the big and tall men's section of Harlem jeans. The melody of TLC's newest ballad drifted across 8th Avenue. In the alcove between the Apollo Theater and Tsitsi's African hair braiding, a cassette bootlegger bumped Shabba Ranks' deepest bass line into the street. Malaya could hear these songs blending with laughter, cat calls, arguments over the prices of African masks and handmade soaps. A Black Israelite man stood on the corner of Frederick Douglass, shaking a leather-wrapped arm at a passersby as car horns and sirens rang somewhere around 123rd. Children snickered as Malaya pushed through the crowd, and an older man shouted, "Whoa," when she passed, splaying his arms and making an exaggerated leap backward out of her way. She pushed through the blocks, with her ears warmed by the foam pads of her Discman, listening to a music that seemed to have been made with her in mind. Her favorite hip-hop song was one she discovered 2 years ago in the 8th grade and claimed it as her personal anthem, an introduction to her newfound idol and kindred soul. "It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine." The track was an irresistible tale of rags to riches, chronicling the rapper's rise from blinding despair to unfathomable technicolor hope. The artist was a big Black man from Brooklyn, with a lazy eye and a face as soft as chocolate frosting. His body puffed like a pouch of Jiffy Pop from beneath his chin, and his voice was always thick and smooth, as though there were a scoop of ice cream perpetually lodged in his throat. Malaya loved the way the man told his success story, how he so prized the vestiges of hard living while casting the present as a gorgeous and unending feast. His album was full of all the things Malaya's mother hated and many of the things her father prized, sex and death and hope and fantasy, all mixed together like a compote, baked into a hard but secretly sweet crust. Malaya loved the paradox of the rapper's moniker, Biggie Smalls, how it was intimidating and diminutive at once, how it said so simply so many of the things she'd been feeling these 15 years of her life. When her mother saw the CD, Ready to Die, laying among Malaya's Sharpie markers and gel pens, she arched her eyebrows and asked, "So this is the message our artists are sending the youth now?" But her father only shook his head and said the album reflected a new generation's struggle and that it was their job as parents not to understand.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing. Yes. Yes. I mean, that just incorporates so many things that the story is about. Just in a nutshell, it's about Harlem. It's about hip hop.
Yeah.
It's about family. It's about, finding space or making space, or how you show up in the world and how other people perceive you because of the ways in which you take up space. So that was a good.
Okay, good.
Everything in there.
Yeah, like to bring the hip hop, bring Biggie into the convo.
Right. Brings Biggie in there as well. So thank you for sharing that. But I'm going to go back a little bit further because,
Okay,
of course, she's 15 by the time we get here. And the
Mm-hmm.
book is introduced. She's actually 8 years old.
Right.
And when I met you in DC a few months ago, you actually read from what was happening with her as a very young girl.
Yes,
And because she's a big girl, at the age of 8, she is in Weight Watchers.
that's right. That's right.
So just tell us a little bit about that, because when I heard it, it was like, what? 8 years old at Weight Watchers? I didn't even realize they had Weight Watchers for children that young, but.
Right. Well, and they don't, right? So
Mhm.
she's there with her mother. Her mother is on Weight Watchers, right? And she, she's bringing her daughter along. And, Malaya is sitting there. She's the only child in this room, in fact, right? And she's sort of observing her mother interacting with all of these women. And, on one hand, it's a lively scene, right? They're talking about the foods they like, and they're, oh, I like, oxtails. And someone else like, yeah, I heard that. I love oxtails too, right? So there's a bonding around food. But Malaya starts to see that this bonding is also about shame, right? They're also bonding over having a sense of shame about their bodies, really struggling to talk about their pleasures and their desires. And so we see Malaya really try to navigate that space, literally trying to make room for herself in that space, to be, free and young and imaginative and still really enjoy her desire for food, right? She's resisting kind of taking in some of that sense of shame around the body, even as, this is one of the moments of her week that she gets to kind of spend time with her mother. So there's a little bit of an ambiguity there. On one hand, she's there with her mother. She sees the vibrancy of this conversation. On the other hand, there's a part of it that just doesn't sit right with her. She's getting ready to go to this art school, right, where she has to go through dance class. But the thing that she's looking forward to most is eating French fries, with her allowance, right? She's going to use her allowance to buy these fries. And for her, it's very important to hold on to the hope and the joy that those fries represent. And so she ends up having to kind of, pay less attention to what's happening in the Weight Watchers scene. And in some ways that sets the stage for one of the central tensions of the novel, is Malaya constantly trying to figure out how to retain her sense of hope, her sense of joy, her sense of imagination, her freedom, really, in an environment that's constantly asking her to change, and precisely to change her body, right, in ways that just, she's not able to do, and doesn't, that doesn't sit right with her, doesn't feel right to her.
Yes, I mean, there's so much in that, the fact that she doesn't know, because I mean, she's only 8 years old.
She's 8 years old, yeah. So all she knows is this doesn't feel right. She doesn't have the language,
exactly.
right?
Like, kids at 8 are supposed to be able to eat ice cream, or whatever it is that they have a desire to have, But it also speaks to the fact, a couple of things. She's being treated like an adult.
Yes.
As a very young child, thinking that she should be able to understand, well, you shouldn't eat this, or you need to count these calories, or you need to be mindful of these points. And we know that there is oftentimes an adultification of Black girls anyway, but just the thought of seeing it come from within her own family.
Right. And I imagine for a lot of us, on a certain level, that's relatable, regardless of what your body shape or size is or was in childhood. We learn a lot about womanhood from the women in our lives, the adult women in our lives. For many of us, that's our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts. And whether they're trying to teach us or not, we observe, right? And, we know that's how children learn. They learn by observing what's around them. So even if you're not, if you haven't had the experience of being taken to Weight Watchers and being told, well, you have to eat this, you have to eat that, just observing how the women in your life trust themselves and trust their intuition and treat their bodies, that ends up kind of seeping in. And so in Malaya's case, in some ways, maybe it's a clearer example of something that I think a lot of us can relate to, right? And then, the teenage years are the years where you start to say, okay, this is what I learned from the older generations in my family. And you start to make decisions about what you want to take with you, what you might want to leave behind, also how you might make changes in your own life that ultimately can help your family set a new kind of legacy for itself. And that's what Malaya is interested in, by the close of the novel. She's like, I want to save myself, and I also want to create a new set of possibility for the women in my family.
And that's so important, and you think a lot of times the expectations that the older are going to teach. And there, of course, things that our elders can teach us, but
Sure.
then the younger people sometimes can push back
That's
on what
right.
they're being taught and say, hey, wait a minute, that may have been what it was,
Right.
That may even be what it is in
Yes.
some instances, but that isn't going to work for me. That isn't the way that I want to live.
That's
And
right.
just seeing her, not just her relationship with her mom, and then of course her grandma, these women in her life that are really like, lose the weight, lose the weight, lose the weight,
Right.
and the things that will happen for you if you lose this weight.
Right.
But, also understanding that it's a lot of projection as well. They're projecting.
Yes. Which, and that too, I think is something we can all sort of relate to, that at a certain point, you come to understand that other people's perceptions of you may not be the whole truth. And in some ways, as you said, they might say as much, if not more, about people's own struggles, right? And that's the case even for the people we love dearly. And so, yeah, Malaya has to come to understand herself on her own terms, right? Defining herself, in her own terms. I'm thinking, as we're talking, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde and this idea that she says, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive.
Yes.
Right? That's the same energy that Malaya is trying to navigate for herself, with a sense of compassion as she starts to see that her mother had to go through that same process, and her grandmother has gone through a similar process, right? So it's not even that there's some kind of like, there's no villain in this story, right? They're just generations of women who have been struggling to navigate the same sets and matrix of power and structures of power that seek to limit and constrain their freedoms. And Malaya is taking it upon herself to just find another way.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I'm just thinking of sometimes the thing that someone's trying to push you against is the very thing that you end up doing.
Yes, that's right. Especially in those teenage years, right?
Right.
That's right.
You're like, don't eat this. And you're like, okay, let me go find a way I can eat that. The very thing that you told me not to do is exactly what I'm going to do.
That's right.
But what I also love is that there is a relationship. There is a dad in the picture. Her dad, Percy or Pra, is also in the picture. And it's almost like the relationship that he has is a little bit different from the way that her mother is, navigating the relationship with her.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, a lot of that has to do with gender, right? That, Percy, the father, he hasn't had to have this same sense of his body constantly being scrutinized, right? He didn't grow up with all those things that women often grow up with. He didn't grow up with parents sort of making sure that he ate a certain way. He didn't grow up with the sense of a mistrust for his body, right? But he did grow up in poverty, living in the projects in Harlem. So in the same way that Nyela, the mother, right, has grown up with this idea of a clear sense that Malaya's body is going to be scrutinized again and is going to be stigmatized, right? So she wants to protect her daughter from that kind of danger. Percy has grown up knowing physical hunger, right? He's grown up knowing what it is to actually feel that physical sense of want and need and lack. And he wants to protect her from that. And so in some ways, Malaya's body becomes a kind of battleground, right? Where these pressures of gender and these pressures of class mobility intersect. And she's this 8-year-old girl who doesn't know what any of this means. But again, she knows how it feels, right? And she knows that it feels untenable to her. Early on, her response, just as you said, her response is to comfort herself in whatever way she can.
Right.
Which for her is, let me eat these French fries, right? But she also, and you kind of maybe hear a little bit of this in the section that I read, she's also a visual artist. So she's carrying Sharpie markers around. She's, carrying colored pencils and pastels. And in some ways, as she gets older, she comes to realize that self-expression is also a comfort, right? And is also a kind of, it has a power that is healthy and healthful, and that can help other people. And so part of the story is about her kind of figuring out which of her pleasures and joys, right, is going to be most useful to her as she writes and thinks her way out of these power structures that she's caught up in.
Yes, and I love the fact that she was a creative because, you can be in any body
Right.
and
That's right.
be, have creativity because it comes from here, it comes from here, has nothing to do with the size of your body.
That's
And I
right.
just love the fact that that was something that she did and she would always turn to it. And people recognized it, even though they may not have always put it at the forefront. It wasn't that they didn't recognize that she had this talent.
Right.
So it was good to see that, so her world didn't have to solely be wrapped up in this thing of what does my body look like.
Yes, that's right. And Percy does see that, right? I mean, the mother does as well. They put her in art school, they encourage her. But Percy he takes a kind of vested interest in nurturing and nourishing that part of her, even as he also is, kind of on the low buying her Chinese food, right? So it's a complex relationship. But he does see that part of her and he sees the importance of that part of her. And he wants to kind of, again, nourish both the body, but also the creative spirit, the intellectual mind, all of that. He wants to nourish the whole being.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking, there's someone in my family that everybody in the family is big, always has been. Grew up, they've always been big. And then, but recently I found out why, because I was told that when the mother was growing up, they didn't always have a lot of food in the house, which makes me think of Percy.
Right. That's right.
Didn't have a lot of food in the house. And so when she had kids, she's like, whatever you want, you can have it. You can have it. And now, all of her kids have struggled, with weight and obesity and things like that because the mom is trying to overcompensate what she didn't have. So, those are just things, I guess, as people who are raising children or responsible, just to be mindful of. Sometimes it could be something that comes from way back. You don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, but there's something that's leading you to make those choices.
Well, and also too, I think it's important to kind of, be aware of that, the fact that, our genetics to a certain degree are mysterious to us, right? So it's like the question of why anybody's body is the way it is always a more complicated story or set of stories than we're led to believe. And I think there's this stigma that says, well, weight is something that everyone should be able to control, that there's one very clear way to control it. And if you're not doing that, it's a kind of moral failure, right? I think that's what society tells us, all of us, women in particular. And I think your point is really important, that logic is inherited and passed down generation over generation. And so is the shame. And of course, then when you're feeling that sense of shame or that sense of, again, just, a lack, whether it's a lack of resources, lack of money, you go to the kind of most readily available source of comfort, of nourishment, of replenishment, right? So it becomes a kind of cycle. But I think it's important to keep in there the part of the conversation that's like, bodies are complicated things, genetics are complicated, and the idea that, that there's one clear and consistent way to manage everybody's body is a lie. And it's a lie that's very lucrative, right? For certain diet companies and for, all of those who want to sell us, particularly women who want to sell us the products that make us feel like we're doing the right thing and feel like we can achieve a kind of unattainable standard, right? In some ways, Malaya is like, let me find my way out of that trap. And it's a trap that gets all of us, again, of any shape or size. You could walk into a group of women and talk about a recent diet and, 9 people out of 10 will be interested, even if you don't know anything about them, women of all shapes and sizes, right? The idea that we all are kind of susceptible or vulnerable to those pressures. Malaya is looking for a way out of that, right? And looking for a way to exercise a different kind of vulnerability that serves her rather than serving people around her.
Absolutely. That was very well said. And as you were talking, it made me think about Lizzo, because my mom and I were talking about her, from last night. My mom, she's like, I don't really know her music, but I love what she stands for.
Yes, that's right. She is a great example. She's an athlete, right? Like a multi-talented athlete.
Right.
We don't know anything about what Lizzo eats, right? We know Lizzo's body is what it is. And thank goodness it is, because it's beautiful. It brings so much joy and hope to the world. And she does things with her body that, the vast majority of us couldn't even hope to do.
Right, right. Because you have to be on stage and playing a flute, working and all that at the same time. Like, girl.
I mean, it's amazing. It's
incredible. Be out of breath. So,
that's right.
For sure. But yeah, it's just watching Malaya and seeing the things that she's going through. And, I mean, of course, we know cruelty from the kids at school, people on the street. We know all of that kind of
Right.
plays into it as well. But I want to shift gears just a little bit, real briefly, and talk about Harlem. Now, I know that you are from Harlem, and Harlem is a character in the book.
Yes. I'm
Harlem
happy
plays
to
a
hear
big
that.
part in the story.
Absolutely.
So I love being able to hear about Harlem from a person who actually grew up in Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to be able to walk through that and to see how it changes as Malaya is growing up.
Right.
Now, is that something that you experienced as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my family, so interestingly, my dad was born and raised in Harlem. I was born in what became New York Presbyterian. At the time it was Columbia Presbyterian. But at the time we lived downtown on the Lower East Side.
Okay.
So we moved to Harlem, which is similar to Malaya's story. We moved to Harlem in the late 80s. My parents had a vision of a kind of, kind of Black community life for me, right? They wanted me to be able to jump double dutch in the streets and, run and hang out with the kids and be on the stoop. And of course, when they moved in the late 80s, this is also the height of the crack epidemic. And so the games kids were playing, rather than just double dutch and, all kinds of made up, hide and seek or whatever, we were collecting crack vials, right? Collecting the colored crack vial caps. And that was a turning point where my parents, came to realize, all right, the vision they had of Black community life in New York City and in Harlem specifically wasn't going to be possible for their family, for me and for my brother. And yet, right, the vibrancy of the neighborhood, you couldn't escape it if you tried, right? I mean, the kind of the beauty of the richness of the food, right? The voices, the multiple languages spoken, the music, all of that, sort of permeated, right? The kind of boundaries of not necessarily being able to hang out and play in the way that we wanted to. And so Harlem really sort of shaped my whole literary landscape, especially music, my relationship to music. And very shortly after, during my coming of age, you start to see gentrification, right? Those kind of first moments where all the vendors on 125th Street kind of disappear. They're swept up under the Shabazz shopping plaza. You start to see chains, right? Like I remember very well the first Starbucks, when that first Starbucks on 125th came. This was it was the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And of course, nobody knew what Starbucks was then, but you did have this sense that all of these changes are happening. And, they come with resources, but they also come with new neighbors, right? Who don't look like us. And suddenly you start to see that some of these changes that people have been waiting for and working toward for decades and decades are actually intended for a whole different group of people, right? So that kind of slow burn of gentrification was something that I absolutely experienced and saw. And you feel the hope, again, of sort of, change and new businesses, especially as a teenager who isn't necessarily conscious of all the displacement, right? I remember the HMV, right? There was an HMV record store on 125th Street, and we thought, this is great. Now we don't have to go all the way downtown to the record store, not thinking about all the businesses that are displaced, the property taxes rising, right? Suddenly rents are rising. But at the same time, for Malaya, seeing Harlem's fight to retain its character, to retain itself, right? Seeing the kind of ingenious, really, strategies that Black business owners employ and that Black communities employ to keep Harlem as long as possible. Malaya finds inspiration in that, because in some ways she's going through a similar story, right? Everyone is kind of telling her to change, urging her to change. She's finding herself changing, but she needs to figure out how to change in ways, again, that serve her, that work for her, and how to let go of what it's time to let go of. So there's a kind of mirroring of her story and the story of Harlem, that they sort of feed each other reciprocally.
They absolutely do. And that's why I wanted to bring that up just in that space, because I was thinking about that. I've had the opportunity to visit Harlem once. It was a few years ago, and it's like, gentrification.
Wow. Yeah.
It's wild. I mean, for me as an outsider, it was still a lot of culture. But I was like, I wonder what it would have been like, 20 years before, 30 years before that. It would have been completely different. Because I took a Harlem tour, and the person leading the tour was a white guy. So in my head, I was kind of like,
that tells you a lot,
right? This ain't right.
Right, right. Yeah, that tells you a lot right there. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really something. And it's interesting because Harlem's story, in some ways, I mean, often in terms of like how people mark the beginning of that phase of Harlem gentrification, they often think of the Bill Clinton moved his after his presidency, moved his offices to the state office building on 125th Street. And that brought in a lot of, again, chain businesses, businesses that hadn't had interest in Harlem, right, previously, essentially. And that was in the mid 90s. So in some ways, Harlem's gentrification, now we're seeing similar stories playing out really across the globe, right? I mean, I live in DC now,
Right.
very similar conversations, right? Atlanta, Durham, right? All of these cities across the country, and even, Paris, right? Berlin, right? Similar stories are kind of happening. Yeah, I mean, and on a certain level, it's a reflection on change, but it's also a reflection on power, right? And in each of these places, you also see people, again, fighting back to keep their identity. And that's what Malaya sort of, derives from this experience that she has.
Malaya, of course, she's dealing with her identity as in terms of, the weight and all the things that other people are telling her that she should be in terms of her size or, the amount of space that
That's right. She
takes
can
up in
take
the
up.
world. But she is a young woman who is growing up. So she's dealing with all the other things that young girls deal with, having crushes, girls and boys,
That's right, everybody.
trying to figure out who she is, and just dealing with some other things of because she looks older than what she is, people trying to take advantage of that. So just talk a little bit about that piece of the story for Malaya.
So, as I said, I mean, from the very beginning, the story is about Malaya sort of getting to know her desires, coming to develop a healthy relationship with pleasure, right? And so in the beginning, this is about food, right? Her desire for food, this forbidden desire for food. But from the very beginning, she's also, at the same time as she's dreaming about French fries, she's dreaming about her crush, this third grader, Dondre Harris, who's a boy. She's also dreaming about eating the French fries with her friend Shanice, who's a girl, right? And, my hope is that the reader comes to see that in some ways, this idea of pleasure being forbidden, of joy being policed and constrained and curtailed, that's a kind of theme throughout Malaya's life from the very beginning of the novel till the very end. So, right, as she comes of age, that desire, and that desire for pleasure is expressed increasingly in terms of physical intimacy, right? Kind of erotic connections with people. But in some ways, it's no different, right? What she wants is to be able to just be free, to listen to her body, to, respect what her body wants, to trust herself and trust her relationship to her body. And so Shanice is this friend who, again, is a crush from the beginning and becomes a kind of love interest. And this is a place where she finds a real sort of respect and, again, a reciprocal relationship in a way that she doesn't find really with anyone else. As you said, there are people who want to exploit her and take advantage of her in different ways and for different reasons. And with Shanice, she doesn't have that, right? Shanice is a place where she can explore herself, she can explore her desire. And there's a sense of a kind of, I don't want to say safety because it's not just safety. There's an erotic excitement, but it's one that doesn't harm her, right? And that isn't going to harm her. And she comes to see, over the course of the novel, she's kind of back and forth about, well, if it's not harming me, is it real? Is it good? And she comes to realize, no, that is what she wants. That's what she wants to pursue. It's love, right? This is somebody who loves her and someone who she loves, as much as teenagers are capable, right? And that's very important to her. And in fact, it's the kind of love that it's a mature love in the sense that it's not, Shanice doesn't want to own her, doesn't want to claim her, nor does Shanice want to be owned or claimed, right? Like they have a clear communication about what their love does and what their love doesn't need to do, which is an important moment for Malaya in her own kind of sense of self and autonomy. She's not looking for herself in anyone else by the end of the novel.
Right. And that is so important.
Mhm.
Just getting to that space of finding yourself. Because hey, she is doing something Malaya is doing or has done something by the end of the book that a lot of older people haven't figured out.
Right. It's true. Well, it's not easy, right?
It's
Yeah.
not easy.
It's
It's
not
not
easy.
easy. It's not easy.
Absolutely.
And I don't know, of course, I was looking at some of your other interviews, and you say that you kind of let the characters talk to you and
Yeah.
tell you who they are. So
Yeah.
is that something that Malaya was doing with you, kind of, or did you know where it was going, or did she kind of lead you along the way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Malaya definitely talked to me quite a bit. And I wasn't always ready for what she had to say. As you said, right? Like she moves so far emotionally and intellectually, right? She travels such a distance from the beginning of the novel to the end. I did know I got the last line of the novel came to me pretty early. The last line in that last scene, I kind of knew. Yeah, I got the words, like I kind of knew what that last line was going to be, and I got the image of her and her relationship to the brownstone, and this idea of kind of, I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't
Right.
read
No
it, but
spoiler.
I kind of knew where we were going, but I had no clue how we were going to get there. And I
Hmm.
really didn't even know what that last line meant until I got to write it. And so I think that has a lot to do with, yeah, she was a very vibrant character from the beginning. And it's interesting because, as we kind of gesture to, many of Malaya's experiences kind of connect with some of the experiences that I have had growing up. But as a character, Malaya is definitely, I think she's funnier than I am. I mean, I find her to be like, I really enjoyed getting to know this character. You know what I mean? Her sense of, kind of commitment to her joy, even in the most difficult times, is something that I learned a lot from, honestly, in writing this character. She's got this kind of like, she's quiet, but
Hmm.
she's got a spark to her that I don't know that I always had as a teenager. But it made her a really enjoyable character to write. My hope is that it makes her an enjoyable character to read. And definitely, I found myself again learning a lot from her because she was able to kind of take in, the challenges and the difficulties and the pain, really, right, that she's experiencing, but was always, able to find something within herself that allowed her to push back, to, shout back, to bite back, right,
Hmm.
in different ways. And that was something that I learned a lot from, and that had everything to do with just kind of like listening to her, letting her guide me, letting her guide the development of the storyline.
Right. One of the other characters that I really loved is my mare. Am I
Yes,
saying it right?
yes, yes.
She was a trip. That's the
Yes,
grandmother. I mean,
yes.
she said a lot of stuff, but she reminded me of so many people's grandmamas,
Is that
even
right?
even mine sometimes. To
Yeah.
say stuff and be so good. Ugh.
Right? And you're just sitting there, just taking it in, like, okay,
Right. It's
what
like
am
that
I
was
gonna
just
do
so
with this?
ugly. But
Yeah.
then when you listen a little deeper, get beyond the ugly of it,
Yeah.
sometimes there's a lot of pearls of wisdom.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, she was another one that I absolutely had to listen to, and I enjoyed listening to Mom Air. Every time she kind of came on the scene, as I was writing, I was kind of like, okay, what are we doing now, Mom Air? Because
Yeah.
she's
Hmm.
what they used to call a pistol, right? Like she's
Hmm.
one of these characters that again always has something, quote unquote smart to say. And it can be very painful. It's been interesting talking to people of different generations about how they interpret that character. It's true. A lot of the things that she says can be very, very hurtful. And Malaya is very hurt by a lot of the things that she says, even as there's always something for Malaya, there's something in listening to her. She likes the way this woman tells stories. She likes the way the woman, her grandmother uses language. And so she has this kind of complex relationship where she's like, this person is saying these things that hurt me. I know they hurt me and I know they're wrong. I know that much of what she's saying is wrong. And there's something about her insistence on using her voice and the
Hmm.
way she uses her voice that for Malaya, she knows there's something to learn from that. And so
Hmm.
in some ways, Malaya kind of takes Mamir's cues in terms of, again, saying wild things and being very kind of like self-possessed in that way. And she says, how can I use that? How can I, take in that inheritance, but use it in a way that serves me and serves my family? And so
Hmm.
that's what she tries to do by the end of the novel.
Right. Yeah. Like I said, I love it because I'm thinking of, both of my grandmothers really.
I had a grandmother like this too.
like, God, golly. I remember my grandmother, my father's mother telling me years ago, telling me not to be a spinster. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
I am a spinster.
Okay, yeah, listen. Nothing wrong with it.
By her estimation, that is what I am.
Right.
But I understood what she was saying because she was,
Right.
her thing was, yes, doing all these other things
Yes.
are great, but to make room and to make space to have love in your life. But
Right.
I have come to realize that love shows up in a lot of different
That's right.
ways. It doesn't
That's
always
right.
have to come from a romantic partnership. It can come in a lot of different ways. So.
Exactly. And for Malaya, part of her journey is
Mhm.
understanding the context in which both her mother and her grandmother grew up and how they learn the lessons they're trying to teach her. They say you can't give what you've never had, right? Malaya, she grows up kind of feeling a bit of resentment that she's not getting a kind of nurturing and this kind of like you said, the freedom that children are meant to have, right? She's not getting that. But as she gets older, she has to start studying her mother and her grandmother to understand, well, they couldn't give those things to her because they didn't have them themselves, right? And so she sort of takes it upon herself to develop that sense of generosity, of kindness, of self-compassion, all of those things that she wasn't able to get, from the women in her family.
One of the other things that I noticed about Malaya is that she observes the other women around her. She's really trying to get a hold of what womanhood is, apart from what she's being told from her mother and her grandmother. And I can't remember her name, but it was like her therapist.
Yes, Dr. Winborn.
Yeah, Dr. Winborn was someone who came into her life who was, a fuller figured woman, all these different things. So she could see what that looked like in a way that's different from what she was seeing with her mom and her grandma.
Absolutely. And it was really important to me to show depictions of big Black women who have different relationships to their bodies, right? Big Black women who love their bodies, who are free in their bodies. And even though this is not who Malaya is raised by, as you said, she seeks out different images of women and how people are doing womanhood so that she can pick and choose what will work for her. And yeah, Dr. Winborn ends up being this figure whose body shape and size are maybe not that different from her mother's, but the way she treats her body and the way she inhabits her body, the way she feels about her body couldn't be further from the way the mother does, right? And so for Malaya, this is the inspiration she needs. It's a new model, it's a new vision, and it gives her this sense of possibility for her own body. And a sense of not only, how she can feel about her body, but what she can do with her body. Mm-hmm. So there's this other, kind of thread that's happening where Malaya actually really enjoys moving her body. Mm-hmm. And it's only when people are telling her she's doing it wrong, she's not fast enough, she's not, to the beat or whatever, that's when that sense of shame comes in. Dr. Winborn gives her a different example of what a big Black woman's body can do in motion. Mm-hmm. And that's really important to Malaya, both in terms of her moving around the city, but also her sense of access to the whole world, right? That she can move, that she's not limited, that she's free in her body. And that's something that model really shows her that's crucial.
Right. I love that because, representation, we hear that all the time. Representation matters.
Yes. Right.
So for Malaya, that was a representation of something different. And I love that, the fact of, how she moves around in her body. And it's like once she started to feel more comfortable in that body and start tuning some things out, then the weight started to come down. Imagine that.
Right, exactly.
Not when people are hammering it in your head, but just because you're saying, okay, I want to get out. Okay, I'm going to walk here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to enjoy my life. And
and it's about joy, right? Like she starts walking because she enjoys it. She she's listening to her music. She's enjoying the city. She's enjoying Harlem as it's changing, right? And there's a sense of beauty and joy in that. And at the same time, right, so she does start to lose some weight, but then also she realizes that that's the only thing that people notice, right? She's seeing all these other changes inside of her. She's, she's speaking up for herself more. She's making more of an effort to kind of be, to have connections with the women in her family. She's seeing all of these, she's doing all this like art stuff. And of course, nobody's seeing any of those changes, right? Like for them, the change that matters most is the weight. But by that time, Malaya is able to say, well, that's on them. That's their failure. That's their blind spot, because I see the changes in myself and I know which changes matter, right? And which are significant and which are necessary for my well-being. And so that's a major kind of achievement for her, right? Like that's a kind of full circle moment for her in a way.
Yeah, and I love it. But it's true. The way that people are is that they will focus on those things because that's what we're taught.
Yes, exactly.
And until we learn to think differently or not place so much emphasis on that, I like seeing that person who becomes evolved just in who they are as a human being,
right?
Not so much about that other stuff. Because I mean, it'll come if it's meant to happen, or maybe it won't happen, but not to make that the key focus.
That's right. And the way most bodies work, we fluctuate in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, over the course of a life, nothing is permanent. Although these changes that Malaya is experiencing, those inner changes, right? Those are the ones that she really wants to hold on to.
Definitely. So just to make sure I get everything in here, all of my questions. Was there anything that I haven't brought up yet that you wanted to make sure that people know about the book?
Well, one of the things that really motivated me to write this book, and one of the things that I'm really excited about sharing with readers, is that, in this conversation about women and bodies and, weight stigma, Malaya is growing up in a time where we don't have terms like fat shaming. We don't have terms like diet culture, right? None of those things exist for Malaya. What she knows, again, is that the expectations of her body don't feel good to her. And so in some ways, she's having to kind of create that language for herself, right? And she has to do it in a way that allows her to constantly be in touch with her joy. And that joy comes through painting, it comes through music, it comes through love, right? Various forms of love with her parents, but especially with Shanice and with the other people in her life. And then in some ways, she's kind of creating a version of fat positivity, body positivity, right? All of that in a time period where it doesn't exist. And so she's drawing from wherever she can find it to create it for herself. And in some ways, I think that's what we all have to do, right? Is kind of take the resources that are around us, be creative to, imagine the lives that we need in order to sustain ourselves.
Right. And I'm just thinking, as you were saying that, being able to, go within and figure out what's going to give us joy, what's going to make us happy, to, push those other voices aside. That's a real significant thing at any age, really. Just thinking of myself personally, there are things that I'm stepping into now that, that put it this way, I'm not in the body that I was, 30 years ago. And even sometimes I may struggle with, I don't look like what I used to look like, or, whatever the case may be. But yet there's so much wisdom. There's so many other powerful things that come with, ages and stages.
That's right.
And it doesn't matter that I'm not in the body that I was in when I was 21. Doesn't matter.
That's right. And nobody is, right? I mean, I think that's the thing, it's a myth that bodies stay the same. They just don't, and the things that our bodies do for us beyond looking a certain way are really just miraculous. I mean, the fact that our bodies are capable of doing all the things they're capable of doing, that's something that I think this is, Malaya spends time really reflecting on that when she realizes just the joy in walking, right? Like it's free. It doesn't cost anything, right? It brings all of this other, brings her to the people she loves and all of that. So really kind of, because she grows up on the outside, right? She grows up never thinking she'll ever look acceptable. So she doesn't even sort of have that belief in meeting the external standard. There's something really valuable in that perspective then, right? Because it opens her to really connect with the beauty, a different kind of beauty of the body. And that's the beauty of the felt experience of the body, which is something that we all have access to. Biggie is another, important figure for her. I mean, we were talking about Dr. Winborn, but in some ways, Biggie is another important figure. He's somebody who he's like, I'm fat. He even thinks of himself as, he has all kinds of things to say about
black and ugly as ever.
That's right, exactly. And he's like, I also am a sexual being. I also have power. I also have incredible, immense creativity, right? And there's a joy that happens not in spite of the body, but through the body that he represents for her that really means a lot. Now, of course, this is her using her creativity to create what she needs, right? Like she knows that Biggie is not talking to her directly, right? This, queer girl, right, who goes to this white people school on the Upper East Side. And yet she finds in him part of what she needs to create the life that she needs to have for herself, right? And I think that's something that we all do. And my hope is that this novel helps people, sort of recognize the strength and the beauty of what we do to survive, right? And the power of expressing that, of telling those stories in ways that can be helpful to other people.
Yes, yes. And as you were talking, it reminded me of, there are points in the book where some of her classmates, like they're reading different, Black, books, some of the iconic or classic books, and they're learning, they're bringing in a whole lot of other parts of the culture. So that's really, I love stuff like that when you can put it all together. So, because you've got the literature, you've got the art, you've got the music, all of that. And the reality of it is all those things kind of impact our lives in a variety of ways. And so to be able to pick, pieces from all of that and then use those things to inform our own stories, I thought that was powerful.
Oh, well, I'm glad you're there. As an English professor, right, I can't not, but I'm an English professor. I'm also a gender sexuality studies professor, and I teach hip hop. In fact, I'm teaching a hip hop course right now. And I always think of hip hop is a literary form. In fact, all of our musics, right, are literary forms. For me, my major influences are Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, Jamaica Kincaid, but also Biggie, A Tribe Called Quest, right? These are all folks who have helped me develop my storytelling strategy, Missy. So yeah, it was important for me to reflect, as you said, the breadth and the kind of complexity of the culture, especially in the 90s, where it's this incredible boom of Black women's literature and this incredible boom of hip hop, right? All of those things are happening at the same time. It was important to me to kind of document that.
Yeah, hip hop and R&B.
That's right.
R&B.
That's right. You're right. That is
all of it in the 90s, especially.
It's so true. It's
so true. Just, and it's things have fallen off, because I was looking at some of the comments about if anybody watched the Grammys. I don't know. Did you watch the Grammys?
I haven't gotten to see it yet. I've recorded it.
Well, number one, I was mad because they had a tribute to hip hop, the 50 years of hip hop is this year, and they cut it off in the middle of it. A commercial came on. I'm like, what's going on here? So I'm hoping that if we go online, we're able to see what got cut off because of the commercial. They cut off on Method Man, like, Method Man?
Come on now, you can't do that.
Meth.
Right.
I mean, just to look at him. But it made me think about what it was and what it is. And some of the comments I saw, I was like, yeah, you can see how hip hop has changed, like how good it was at the beginning of the tribute,
right? So they went like chronologically.
Yeah. So by the time they got to the end, I was like, who is that? What are they talking about?
But it's just as you said earlier, right? We do have a lot to learn from younger generations.
Right. That is true.
Sometimes we have to I'll speak for myself. I find that sometimes I have to be deliberate about, sort of suspending my own sense of what is good and what is bad, and listening. Like my students really, they teach me a lot about why they like the music they like. And what I'm looking for in hip hop is often different from what they're looking for. But when I see it from their perspective and learn, well, why do you love this rapper? I can appreciate it in a different way. And it helps me to see the connections between the rappers that they love and, the history, the legacy, right? The people that influence these rappers. So, I think that's me as a teacher, but I do believe we can learn a lot from the younger generations, even when, as
we don't understand it.
That's what I was going to say. As Percy says in the section that I read, right? He says, it's our job as parents not to understand. That's also true too. People need something to rebel against, right? So that's how I feel like that's how culture grows.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know that you have, we don't have a lot of time left, but you have your other book, The Poetics of Difference, that you just won this wonderful award for. So congratulations on that.
So
that's the 2023 MLA William Sanders Scarborough Prize. So what exactly is that?
Sure. So The Poetics of Difference is a book of literary theory that explores how Black queer and feminist writers of the African diaspora use, narrative forms, storytelling forms, and poetic forms to make comments about intersectionality. So we were talking about Ntozake Shange, for example, right? She develops this genre called the choreo poem in the mid 1970s to, use poetry and theater and dance to tell stories of Black women's experiences of the body, of desire, relationships. Similarly, I make the argument that, those new genres like the choreo poem connect with experimentalism in other forms with writers like Dion Brand, writers like Susan Laurie Parks, Toni Morrison, but also rappers like Missy Elliott, right? How they kind of disturb the expectations of language, of genre, in order to make comments about Black womanhood and Black genders and sexualities. So that's out on the University of Illinois Press. And yeah, I mean, I was super excited and thrilled to receive that recognition from the Modern Language Association for it.
Yeah, yeah. When I saw that, I was like, "Oh wow, she's getting all these big awards and whatnot."
It's been a good year. I can't complain.
Yes, yes. So, are there any? I know that you told me earlier that you're back in the classroom this semester. So, are there any things in the works in terms of literary works, or are you just kind of taking a break, or what can we be on the lookout for?
Well, so I'm kind of, I'm working on the next thing. So we'll see. I think, I have some time set aside to work on that over the summer. I have, events. So follow me on Instagram. I've got a few kind of events, several events actually, especially between now and April. And then the Big Girl paperback comes out in June. So really excited about that.
Yeah, I saw that cover today.
Yeah. So, and there'll be some other stuff kind of happening around that time. So really excited about that. And then the UK version comes out. So, it's been released in North America, but the UK and Commonwealth, so Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, that version is coming out in the summer as well. So a lot of exciting things to look forward to.
Okay, so you can ride this wave for a while.
Yes, right. While also working on what's next, which I'm very excited about.
That's cool. Well, we have let's see, got a couple of things. Thank you, Marcy and Mecca, for an excellent, informative, thoughtful discussion. Looking forward to reading the book. I'm definitely going to recommend this book for my book club. Yes, Paula, please do.
Paula, yes, please do, and keep in touch.
Looks like, I can read what it says. Anything coming that combats the attack on gender, teaching, and living in America? Like any stories, or I know you write a lot of essays and things like that as well.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, the Poetics of Difference that we were just talking about, that's absolutely part of what it's thinking about from the perspective of creative practitioners, right? So sort of how again, Black feminist writers, artists, scholars, thinkers use their art to combat some of the limits that are placed on the expression of, especially kind of radical expressions of Black womanhood. But, I also have to shout out, specifically thinking about teaching, this incredible anthology, Teaching Black, which actually, you can't really see it, but I think it's one of the books on my staff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's phenomenal. It's edited by Drea Brown and Anna Maureen Lara. And it is, it's an anthology of Black feminists, mostly Black feminists, but Black scholars and teachers writing about the experience of teaching Black content and teaching Black students and sort of the intersections of Blackness and critical literary pedagogy, right? So teaching literature and teaching creative expression from Black perspectives is just gorgeous. So, I definitely encourage folks to check that out. I have actually an essay in there about this hip hop class that I was talking to you about. Yeah, so it's a gorgeous anthology. Highly recommend it.
And that's just so important right now, because we know that folks are trying to do away with our history, with our literature, with anything that is going to help us realize just how wonderful we are.
That's right.
And tell our stories. People are looking at ways to do away with it. So anything that we can do to support, like your works like Teaching Black, to have these kinds of conversations.
That's right.
That's just important, because we don't want. Well, they're not going to take it away from us, because we'll find a way. Even if it's not in that class or in that school, we're going to figure out a way to put it out.
We always do. We always do.
Absolutely. Innovate is what we do.
That's what we do. It's beautiful. It is beautiful.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. So, well, actually, hold on for me for a second so I
Sure.
can, say a proper good night.
Okay, sounds good.
But thank you for being here. I'm going to announce next week's book. So just hold on for 1 second.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been
You're
lovely.
welcome.
Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. You're welcome. Give me one moment.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being with me this evening with me, Mecca and Marcy. How about that? Thank you so much for being here for that wonderful conversation. As I mentioned, I met her a few months ago and she did a talk at the Well-Read Black Girl Festival. And I was like, oh, I like her. If she's tall like me, I need to go talk to her and see if I can get her over here. So I'm super excited to have had her with us and looking forward to doing it again. Now, in terms of next week's show, I will have Goldie Taylor here to talk about her book, her memoir, The Love You Saved. You may be familiar with that name because she is a journalist, so you may have seen her on the news and doing other things like that. So look for her next week. And then in 2 weeks, we will have Wade in the Water by Nyela Nkrumah. So be on the lookout for those 2 books coming up in the next couple of weeks. And you know me, I always got some surprises up my sleeve. So that's just Monday nights. Of course, we have our Wednesday night Live Well Sister as well. So it'll be a lot of wonderful, fantabulous Black women coming to chat with us over the next few weeks. So I look forward to seeing you again real soon and have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.